out, who has been researching our servicemen most assiduously and has built up for us a most wonderful record of the lives of the men of Banstead who lived here 100 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming today to the commemoration. If you've not been before, we had about 450 men from Banstead and Burheath went off to serve their country all over the world. About 130 of those men never came back. We are in the middle of a run of Passchendaele commemorations at the moment. We've got 13 men that lost their lives in that battle. But we're actually going to go back 2 years before that today. Because George Turner, who we're commemorating today, although he lived in Banstead, he has no memorial here. He left the village shortly before war broke out. And so we didn't know his connection to Banstead until very recently. George was born in Fulham on the 20th of May, 1896. He was the eldest of 7 children born to Richard and Ellen Turner. The family moved around several addresses in the Fulham area before they came to Banstead. George was about 9 or 10 years old when he came here. He's one of the very few men that we know for certain actually attended the village school, that we have documentary evidence for. And he did well in his studies. He was a bright boy. It's described as having a studious nature. And he won a free scholarship to Sutton, the Sutton County School, now Sutton Grammar School. Now, that was the best quality education that could be provided to any of our local boys, and it was something that they all strived for. Several of the men we're commemorating actually went on to study at Sutton as well. And George was a near contemporary there of Fred Davis, a man who died just a couple of weeks before him in 1915. If you're coming to the graveyard tour later, we'll be visiting the grave of Archie Jakes, another one of those Sutton Grammar School boys who lost their lives in the war. Now, George studied well at school, and he won a scholarship as an apprentice bricklayer, a trade scholarship as an apprentice bricklayer to a local builder, Mr. Pink, who was based in Banstead and later then at Kingswood and Merston. Now, George's dad was a builder, so he was following in the family trade, and I believe that his father was actually a foreman for Mr. Pink at the time. So George worked as a bricklayer, learning the trade, and also studied down at Redhill, a technical college that's been set up there. When he had completed his apprenticeship and began to work as a bricklayer, he lived with his family still in the local area. They'd been living in Ferndale Road, what's now number 55, was at the time number 3 Fern Terrace. All the houses in the roads up by the Brighton Road had either names, or for short terraces they were individually numbered, and the terrace itself would have a name. It was only during the First World War that those were all standardised to have the numbering system that we have today. And so he lived there for several years before they moved to Kingswood in 1913. And the house they went to, you'll see it as you drive up the A217 towards Reigate. It's called Cambridge Cottage, and it stands on the right, just as you're climbing the hill into Lower Kingswood. It's a flint-faced cottage just past the Kingswood Social Club. And indeed, members of the family have continued to live in Kingswood for many years afterwards and have a long connection with the village. So George lived there with his parents, and then when war broke out, he was too young to serve. But that didn't make much of an obstacle for many of our local men. And many of our young 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds lied about their age to join up. And that's what George did in March of 1915. He claimed he was 19 years and 1 month old. You had to be 19 to go and serve overseas. So he was just old enough. You'll see our local boys signing up 19 years and 0 days, 19 years and 2 days. He joined Kitchener's new army of volunteers down on the south coast. He was down in Shoreham, in a hutted camp there. Now, they'd only just started to get khaki uniforms. They'd had whatever they could find then. They had no rifles or anything like that, very little equipment. They're being trained by ex-Boer War veterans. It was quite disorganised. The training was quite unimaginative. There was a lot of marching backwards and forwards across the countryside. And George wrote a number of letters home with his parents, and he just pretty much describes lots and lots of route marching backwards and forwards, and not very much happening at the time. In the beginning of the summer, in July, they moved to Aldershot, to Blackdown Camp. George said it was called Blackdown because when you were marching in the hot, sticky weather, you got covered in this dust and you ended up black down from your head to your foot. And it's there that they first were issued with their rifles, and they learned how learn how to fire them, and they started to do more intensive infantry training. Life in the army, of course, was very much still had periods of quiet and boredom much of the time, particularly when training. And so the only interesting things that would happen to George would be occasional guard duties. And the only thing he really looked forward to was to come and see his family, because they were still local and Aldershot's not too far away, so he could get a Sunday pass and come and visit them. Before they left for France eventually, the men would have a slightly longer leave. For many men, a last leave with their families. And George grumbled one time in a letter home because he just got his leave pass signed when they put him on guard duty and he had to stay in camp for the weekend. At the end of July, they were inspected by Lord Kitchener and the King, a sure sign that they were impended for the front. And on the 31st of August, they began to leave for France. They arrived the following day near Boulogne, spent a couple of weeks spent a little while under canvas before they were billeted on farms in the French countryside. It was very boring. There was nothing to do. George complained there were no shops. The beer was too weak. The cider was too weak. The apples were too sour. But the blackberries were huge, and he enjoyed those very much. And the men would gather the blackberries and apples to make themselves a pudding to supplement their army ration. He said there were no men in the countryside. They'd all gone to the front. So the women were working in the fields, and he said he wouldn't think that an English girl would do those sorts of things. And of course, the women's land army proved him how wrong he was in later years. He said they talked about the French children there, and they were about this high, 8 years old, and all smoking. And they tell them off and say, you're not old enough to smoke. And they said, we can smoke, we are old enough. So they, after a couple of these boring weeks, the only things that were enlivening this time was a paranoia about spies. One sentry even opened fire on a car that refused to stop. There was a lot of drinking and things going on. George seems to have been kept himself on the straight and narrow in those regards, but Roberts Castleton, one of our other local men that fell, who was serving in the same battalion as George, actually found himself aged 16 in shackles for 3 days for some sort of misdemeanour, probably drinking. At the end of the month, they marched off. They'd known something was up, and they got their orders to march off, and over a series of nights, they moved towards the town of Loos. Now, the mining district about Loos is quite well, I suppose it's quite similar to here. It's got a bit of rolling chalk downland, nothing too high, nothing too low. Lots and lots of clutter, mine heads and slag heaps and railways running across the landscape. Plenty of cover for skilled fighters. It was relatively flat, so those slag heaps were very important observation points that both sides expended hundreds of lives protecting or trying to capture. And it was on this landscape that the British Army was going to attack at the end of September. A joint offensive had been arranged with the French. We were very much the junior partner in the early days of the war, and we were just helping just one of their pincers, this broad pincer movement that was going to pinch out a salient many, many miles wide. It was genuinely believed that this could be a war-winning attack in those days. They thought they could force their way through to the plains of Douai, cut the German communications, and the war would be over by Christmas. Now, the British commanders didn't view this plan with much favourability at all. They could see that this wasn't going to end well unless they had a trick up their sleeve, and they did. They had gas for the very first time. We were going to use chlorine gas, and the cylinders of gas, codenamed Accessory, were carried up over many nights to the front line. And it was hoped that this gas would blow over the German trenches, take them by surprise, knock them out, and we could walk our way to victory. George was not going to be in this first wave of troops that went over the top. They were actually in reserve, and they were held back from the battlefield, far too far back from the battlefield. They were held under a different commander as well. Douglas Haig had only just sort of come to prominence, really, and he was commanding the troops that were attacking. And Sir John French, the old guard, the commander-in-chief, was hanging on to the reserves. And the two men had started to fall out. There was some animosity between them. If anything could go wrong with communications between them, it was bound to go wrong at the crucial moment. And it did at Loos. Douglas Haig's men fought their way through the front line. The wind was a bit backwards and forwards, not very strong. And so in some areas the gas knocked out the Germans. In other areas it blew back onto our own line. And other times it just hung around in no man's land doing nothing. But where it did blow over, we were able to gain a foothold in the German trenches and make a lot of progress. And the men pushed on towards their objectives, but they were losing heavily all the time that they advanced. And by the time they'd captured them and the time they'd reached them, they were too weak to hold them, and the German counterattacks were coming in and starting to force us back. So the reserves were needed to be moved onto the battlefield. Now, Haig and French took several hours to agree this between themselves. And so the battle that had started at 6 in the morning, it was 11 hours after that that George's battalion got their orders to go onto the battlefield. Of course, it would be far too late. It would be pitch dark by that time. They'd never been in a trench at all, let alone the trenches in these sectors. They had no idea where they were. So they would have to wait for the next day to make an attack. So they made their way to the front line as best they could, going through these communications trenches that were jammed full of all the debris and detritus of war and all the wounded men trying to get back from the front. And they eventually found themselves somewhere near their objective, which was going to be the German second line near the village of Hulluch. Now, Hulluch is a village which is, if we put ourselves on the battlefield here, at the back you're the British, over here we're the Germans. Now, the British would have the little village of Hulluch over here. Over there you'd have the height of Hill 70, and just behind it the French mining town of Long. And that was a very important prize for the armies, and that was one of the overall objectives for this attack. Now, between you at the back and us at the front, there's a very shallow valley. So the men of George's battalion, the 8th Queen's Royal West Surrey, and the other men in their brigade from the East Surrey Regiment and the East Kent and the West Kent, waited in trenches that they'd arrived at about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. When dawn broke, they could see what their situation was. They changed their dispositions. They came forward over here to occupy some old German trenches ready for their attack, which was to take place in the middle of the morning at 11:05 a.m. They moved off in good order, moving towards their objective, the second line here behind me here, between Hulluch and Long. It was about 1,500, 2,000 yards away from them. There's very little cover in this landscape. It wasn't kind of the moonscape that we think of for Passchendaele. It had very long grass still all over this. That was pretty much the only cover that they had. The Germans could see them coming from the other side of this shallow valley, and they opened fire almost immediately. As the men advanced towards them, they came under fire from a belt of trenches that was protecting the village of Hulluch over there. They had to advance 500 yards past that. It wasn't their objective. Nobody else was attacking it, so the defenders there were completely unmolested to fire into the Kent and Surrey men as they advanced. They made their way in good order, in extended order, lots of space between them, as far as they could, closer to the German line. They were taking casualties all the time from the side. Then we had people on Hill 70 starting to open fire, all the time walking into fire from the front. They came under point blank fire from German artillery firing over open sights behind the line, and then the British started to shell them too as they advanced, the barrage falling short, causing many casualties. Despite all of this, despite never having been on a battlefield before, of having had rudimentary training, of having never been to the place before, no idea really where they were going, they reached their objective, the German second line. When they got there, they found that the wire had not been cut by the artillery. They tried. They lay in the grass the long grass in front of it, and every now and then groups of men would get up and they'd dash to the wire and they'd try and cut it. The Germans shot every man down. They tried to do. Not a single man got through the wire. At one point, the Germans were even standing up behind their trenches, shooting as fast as they could. They called it the field of corpses. They admired the gallantry of these men that were attacking them. It was no good, and the men in the end just lay down in the long grass and waited for orders. And in the end, the orders did come: withdraw. There was no panic. The men moved in good order. They walked back through bullets and shrapnel all the time. They left a rear guard behind to cover them, and then they eventually made it back to the British trenches. George didn't, however. He is one of the missing men. There were many missing men. The 72nd Brigade of Kent and Surrey men had about 2,000 casualties in just that single day. Now, of those, 3 of them are from Banstead. Advancing just ahead of George that day were 2 of the men that worked at the asylum, Albert Ingram and Percy Gould. They'd known each other for a long time. They joined the asylum together within about a week of each other. They joined the army together on the same day, and they died together on the same day. We commemorated them about 2 years ago. George's parents struggled to accept the fact that their son was missing, and when a letter, his final letter, was found by a guardsman, the Coldstream Guardsman, on a body, they struggled to accept that it was George and were asked for more proof, more identification. And on the local war memorial in Lower Kingswood, when George was commemorated there, his name was the last to be added, his parents holding out until the end. He's commemorated in Lower Kingswood, in Tadworth, in Kingswood, in the churches there, and on the war memorial at Kingswood. But he has no memorial here, so I hope we've put a right wrong today. He was just 19 years old. We have some members of the family here today, and I'd like to ask them if they'd like to join us to toll the bell at the back of the church 100 times in George's memory.
So we're going to have around 10, okay? 10. Good, we've got exactly 10. 7, 8, 9, 10. Fantastic. So 10 each. So what we need you to do, if this is the rope that tolls the bell, it's not one of those ones we've got over here.
Dear God, they shall grow not old, as we too are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years contend. At the journey and the sun, and in the morning, we shall remember them.
We shall remember them.
Let us pray. Lord, we give you thanks for the life of our village today, and for the opportunity to reflect on its life in centuries gone by, and for our remembering of this place 100 years ago, and the life of the young men of this village who travelled to the sites of the battlefields and who gave their lives in service to this country. We thank you for their courage and for their comradeship. As we remember them, we remember also the families that they left behind, the parents who were so anxiously hoping that their son would return home, like so many others were hoping in vain. We pray that in our remembering we may be the more determined to live in peace with one another today, so that war may not be the cause of the loss of so much young life. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. Amen. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for remembering George today.